Hello, it's Queensland Storyteller time again. I'm Kim Dodsworth. We all have books we can read again and again. For me, one such book is This Above All by Eric Knight. It was written at the height of World War II and published in London in 1942. These were dark days for England and the prospect of German invasion very real. The story is about an army deserter, Clive Briggs. He's an intelligent man and no coward. He fought bravely at Dunkirk, but has now reached a point of no return with senseless killing. I'm going to read Chapter 1 of This Above All as a short story. It's a masterful introduction by a brilliant writer. The theme of the book appears on page 1. It's a quote from Hamlet. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell, my blessing season this in thee. When spring was almost done, the war began in earnest. In that town, people walking along the esplanade could hear the guns. The people were somehow relieved. They said, "The Sitzkrieg's over at last." They walked in the hard sunshine and waited for news of victory and listened to the guns. The guns were not loud, for they were far away, far up the channel, over on the continent. But when the fine breeze came in gladly from the sea, the sound of the guns came muttering with it, and people said, "Hear that? Now he's catching it." Sometimes the sound was a single one, a trembling of air, as if someone had stroked a big drum with one finger. Sometimes the sound overlapped into a long mumbling, like a dog's first growling. But still the holiday people and the seashore trippers walked gladly in the unusually good weather. They promenaded on the stone-faced esplanade, breathing deeply of the rotting kelp and brine smell of the sea. Only occasionally they would stop and say, "Listen, hear that? The guns. Yes, now he's catching it at last." They listened half anxiously, because it was after all a war, and half gladly, because now all the nervous strain of waiting was over. But they were confident about the boys over there and the Allied armies, and the sounds were too crooning and remote to have evil meaning. In a curious way, they were personally proud when they heard the far-off cannonading. It was as if hearing the guns allowed them to take some small but important part in the war, as if, by the mere act of listening, they were also serving. The weather was beautiful for walking. Sometimes the people strolled out beyond the town, going up to the cliff top. There, high up over the channel, the sea breeze came over more steadily, like greater music. That steady wind always blew. The grass tops were riffled in sweeping planes so that they reflected the blue of the sky. Far below, in the bays and coves, the waves moved in like a slow-motion picture. The guns sounded much plainer up there. Just sitting or lying there and listening made one feel in some indefinable way like a pioneer. The guns sounded louder in the town too. Some of the holiday people started leaving. After that, to the regular townspeople, the unusual spell of beautiful sunshine began to seem like a wasteful gesture of nature, like an oversupply of fruit in a peculiar glut season, or an inexplicable run of herring when every fishing smack had such a remarkable catch that no one could sell any in the overcrowded market. For fine weather in that town was a business. If there hadn't been a war, the place would have been jammed. All the boarding houses, all the hotels, even the Channel Hotel, which was the most exclusive. That was the only way to make money, to be packed to capacity in the fine weather. They said, "After all, it's only a short season at best, and you have to make what you can to carry you through the winter." Now at last they had good weather, and yet the place was, as they said, getting practically empty. They didn't blame the war much. Rather, they blamed the weather. It wouldn't have been half so bad, they said, if it had only been rainy. They wished it would rain, so that all the fine sunshine wouldn't go to waste. But they tried not to complain. After all, they said, "There's a war on." One should be ready to do his bit without complaining, now that the war had really started at last and you could hear the guns. You could hear them very plainly now, especially at night, when the blackout made the town unusually still and hushed. Then the place went dead. People went for a short stroll after dinner, And when they came back for a nightcap in the bar, they said it was curious how clearly you could hear the guns at night. Before May became June, you could see the gunfire. The sky to the southeast blinked and flashed and sometimes broke into a sustained glow. Each night, the glowing crept farther west. The situation seemed confused. In the Channel Hotel bar, everyone listened stolidly to the BBC. But that didn't make it any clearer. When the news was over, they said, "Well, you couldn't expect the BBC to broadcast information that would give away our plans to the enemy, could you?" It was all very confusing until Churchill declared it was the Battle of the Bulge. That made it easier to understand. The Germans had pushed into a great salient. If you drew a picture, you could see how simple it was. All we had to do was press at the neck from the north. The French do the same from the south. Anyone could understand it. One wondered why the Germans had been so utterly foolish as to get into such a situation. But soon no one spoke of the Battle of the Bulge anymore, just as no one spoke about Hitler missing the bus anymore. Now the guns were drumming away and rattling windows all the time. They blazed away to the southeast, the south, and finally to the southwest too. The war was going farther and farther along the channel, and everyone seemed so impotent. Something seemed to be wrong. It was as if the Esplanade were a grandstand and the war was parading past right under your eyes, and you couldn't do anything to help. The guns drummed away all day and all night, but no longer they said, "Now he's catching it," for at last they began to think that it could be the other way round. The shells might be dropping on their own men. For the first time, people began to think about high explosives and screaming steel and human flesh. All but a handful of the few remaining visitors packed up and left. It was too terrible to sit in the glorious sunshine all day while the guns told you of this horrible thing happening almost under your eyes. The British Army was being slaughtered practically as you looked on, for it was clear now that it wasn't the German right wing that was surrounded. It was the British Army. It came out over the BBC that the Belgian king had surrendered and left the flank open. The Belgians had let them down. The French had let them down. There was nothing now but the British Army surrounded by greatly superior forces. The Germans had Calais. They were within a few miles of Dunkirk. The British Army was fighting for its life. And then at last, war became terrible. When people heard the guns, they shuddered. It was horrible to think of that endless cascade of shells being poured in on the tightly compressed body of the British Army. The nights became a torture of sound. There were crashes that almost shattered the windows. It meant the warships were in action. The fleet was trying to help hold back the German army. Now at night, the skies erupted bursts of light and glowed with flame. In the day, V-shaped squadrons of planes went roaring out over the cliffs. They snarled away at top speed, and people knew they were racing to help plug up the leaking left flank. The planes tore away and came back. They shuttled over the channel with their loads of bombs so endlessly that it seemed as if both men and machines should drop from the sky in defiance of aerodynamic laws from sheer weariness. It was then that, at last, the fine weather ended. It turned foggy. The very last of the visitors left. They felt it had been a terrible experience, but they had stuck it out. And one thing, the weather had been fine. It was no use saying now that the one good thing about it had come to an end. The fog kept up for 2 days. In those 2 days, they got the British Army out. Naval craft, private craft, it didn't matter. Tugs, destroyers, yachts, trawlers, barges, pleasure boats, rowboats, canoes, almost anything that could float. They got in and got them out while the rearguard fought the enemy off. The beggars' flotilla went back and forth all day and all night, and all the next day and all the next night, as long as the boats stayed afloat. Men sailed them. That way they got most of the British Expeditionary Force home again, but not all. For the fog lifted and it was fine again. The guns still went on pounding, and people knew that some of the rearguard was still alive in Dunkirk. Those men fighting knew there wasn't much chance of getting boats to them now that the fog had lifted. But they fought on. As long as the guns went on, it meant there was a rearguard left. Standing on the Esplanade, the people of the seashore town knew that. They thought that, and listened to the guns pounding away at human flesh. They stood in the sunshine and thought of it over and over. They were hearing the British rearguard being smashed to bits. Suddenly, everything became very quiet. The sun shone uselessly and splendidly on the holiday town. It shone on the empty splendour of seaside resort magnificence, the esplanade, the unbroken regiments of ornamental lampposts, the steadfast battalions of benches. The guns had stopped. It was all over. The Germans had Dunkirk. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that brief extract from This Above All by Eric Knight. I'm Kim Dotsworth. I'll be back again this time next week with another short story of quality. Till then, bye for now.